Hi everyone, welcome to FOUT 1064. We are now on week 9, and this is probably one of my favorite parts of the course. And this is where we talk about some of the challenges that lens designers face when they design a lens. And some of these problems are things that we should know about as photographers, so that when we go shopping for a lens and we read that spec sheet that we were talking about last week, so that when you look at those technical specifications that we talked about last week, you'll see that they list some of those problems that lens designers face. So the more we know about them, the better we will be at choosing lenses, or at least understanding why good lenses cost more than some other lenses. And typically it's because they're solving some very difficult problems. Anyways, let's get started. So, in a perfect world, and we all might have a definition of what a perfect world might be. You know, maybe there's no war. Maybe in a perfect world, plastic biodegrades and becomes a fertilizer. But for photographers or anybody who works with a camera or works with lenses, there's a different sort of definition of what their perfect world is. And really, what we're talking about is, for a lens designer, what's their perfect lens? What's their perfect lens for image formation? So one thing that lens designers try to do, and I guess it's one way of testing a lens, is, hey, if you photograph a point, and if you can imagine a black background and a tiny little white dot, if you photograph that dot, it should appear as a white dot, tiny white dot on your sensor, and later on when you're looking at the photo on your screen or in a print, that white dot should look like the original. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes that dot isn't round, sometimes that dot is a different color. So there's things that can go wrong. Another thing that lens designers try to achieve is that if you photograph something that is a flat plane, flat surface, imagine a brick wall or a door or, the side of a truck, I don't know, any sort of flat surface. Well, and assuming that you're photographing it dead on, looking straight perpendicular with your lens axis perpendicular to that surface should appear square. You shouldn't appear distorted. And another way to test the quality of a lens, or again, one of the goals for lens designers, is that, hey, whatever shape you photograph, the image of that shape should match the original. So those are some of the things that lens designers are trying to achieve, and that us as photographers, we would expect to happen, or expect our lenses to produce. So, however, that doesn't always happen. And if you look at these three images, there's some things that are going on that are kind of creating some problems. And if you look at that building on the left, and we're going to look back at it, later on, you'll see that the vertical lines aren't perfectly vertical. And if you look at that garage door on this, you can see that it looks like it's a bit bowed a little bit, typical of what you'd see with a wide angle lens. And when we look at this picture on the right, there's some round light fixtures, and they were round in the original, but in the photo they are not. So today, we're going to, like I said, we'll talk about problems, and these problems have a name, and they are called lens aberrations. And we're going to look at more than just lens aberrations today, but let's start there. So what is a lens aberration? Well, there's the definition there, at least one definition. And so any problem that causes the failure of light rays to converge on one focus point or focal plane. So if you are unfamiliar with the word converge, that just means come together. So you can imagine all the light going through a lens and converging to a focus point. So anything that keeps all the light from going to that focus point, that's a lens aberration. And typically when we talk about lens aberrations, we're talking about problems with the design of the lens, or the shape of the lens. So there's a bunch of these aberrations. We're going to just talk about the most common and the type of aberrations you'll usually read about if you're reading a review on a lens, or if you go and read somebody's blog where they're talking about lenses and things like that. So the first one is chromatic aberration. And if you did the readings this week, there was an article that went into, that was from Nikon, and it sort of outlined what chromatic aberrations are all about. So chromatic aberration, the inability of a lens to bring all the colors to a common focus. So, right now, there's light striking my face, and we consider that white light, and we've had this discussion before. We always think of light as being white light, but really, white light is just a mixture of red, green, and blue wavelengths, and when we receive all three of those colors or wavelengths, we interpret it as white. Well, you might recall last week we talked about dispersion, and that's, we talked about refraction. Light goes through one medium into another, it refracts, it bends. But dispersion is when that is caused by the different wavelengths refracting at a different angle. They each have their own refractive index. So they're bending at different amounts. So what comes out the other end of, say, a prism is actually a rainbow color. And that's what this diagram is showing us here. So white light comes in, but it's kind of like a rainbow comes out the other end. And I gave you some extra information there. Blue tends to refract more than, or bend more than red. And so it has a slightly different focus point than red. So blue and red don't have the same focus point, or that the distance from the lens to the sensor is slightly different for those two colors, at least where they focus. Hopefully that makes sense. I think this diagram probably illustrates it a little bit better. And you can see what this is showing us is the light is coming from the left-hand side, going through the lens, and on the right, where we see those three colors there, I'll just draw this here. So remember, light is always traveling in this direction, and this is the real world, and this is, so I'm just going to write real world here. Real world, and boy, terrible handwriting. It's hard to write with one of these Wacom tablets. And this area here is inside the camera, okay? Camera. Yeah, there we go. So inside the camera. And anytime we see this type of diagram, that's usually the way it'll always play out. The left-hand side is the real world, and the right-hand side is inside the camera. There are two types of chromatic aberration, and I think these two diagrams kind of illustrate it very well. The first one is axial, and what that means is, and that's kind of like what we were just looking at here, that's where the light focuses at slightly different distances from the sensor, or sorry, from the lens. So the focusing distance is just slightly different. Lateral is a little bit different, where the light is focusing at the right, all three are focusing at the right place, but the distance away from the optical center is different. So imagine the center of your sensor out towards the corners, the red, green, and blue light are not quite landing together the way that they should. So that's axial and lateral. And there's a couple of diagrams there that kind of illustrate the effect. And I am almost positive that you, at some point in your life at least, have seen this sort of thing happen, where you've got this red, not red, but more of a magenta, bluish magenta, and then cyan color fringing some of the artifacts in or some of the objects in your photo. So I think about landscapes, and if you look at some tree branches, you might see some of this fringing that's going on, and you can actually correct for some of that in Lightroom. Anyways, I'm sure all of you have encountered it. There's always, at some point, a weak point in the lens somewhere where you'll see that. So how do you solve that problem? Well, you might recall last week we talked about negative and positive lenses. Last week, I gave you some examples where negative and positive lenses work together to solve a problem. Here's another example where they work together to solve a problem. So if you take two lens elements, and one's positive and one's negative, and not only that, they are made out of two different types of glass, and it has to be two different types of glass that have a slightly different refractive index, so they slightly bend the light differently, and you put them together, you get this situation where the first lens splits the light apart, or sorry, the different colors apart, and then the negative lens brings them back together, but at a slightly different amount, so the problem sort of cancels each other out, and they come to a focus point. This is not a optics class, as I mentioned before. That happens at Western down the road, where they have a whole area where they study optics and physics. The goal here is just to give you a sense of kind of, hey, how lens manufacturers solve some problem. So there's a thing called an achromatic doublet, and whenever you see that letter A, it's almost like the opposite, the anti, so chromatic aberration, achromatic, so it solves that problem of this chromatic aberration. So an achromatic doublet uses crown glass for the convergent lens, so the positive lens, and flint glass for the divergent lens. Now you can look up what crown glass is and flint glass is. These are just two different types of glass, two names for two different types of glass. Again, beyond the scope here, just know that it's two different types of glass. Two different types of glass, and each has its own refractive index. So you put those two together, and it has to be two different types, and what it'll do is correct, or at least try to correct that chromatic aberration problem. And what I've shown you here in this diagram kind of illustrates the point that no lens is perfect. They all do a pretty good job, but this sort of illustrates that, hey, we've got a big blob because all the three colors aren't lining up. And that the reason that this blob is so big is because we're not focused for blue light, we're focused closer to that sort of yellow-orange light. And so red creates a bit of a blob, and so does blue, because they're not quite lining up. But here we've got our achromatic doublet, and the problem has been greatly reduced. Not totally they haven't completely removed the problem, but it's definitely reduced. So that was one way of solving this chromatic aberration. Another thing that manufacturers can do is they use something called low dispersion glass. And you'll see this in their marketing and in their advertising. They'll talk about this type of glass. And basically what they're doing is they're using some other material other than flint or crown, because it tends to refract less, or it tends to not disperse the light as much, the different colors anyways. So for example, lenses that incorporate one element made of fluorite, and you will see this in, just look at some of the brochures or ads for different lenses, and you'll see that they'll advertise that they use fluorite lenses. And basically, this is material that, it's a crystal that they can find naturally, but they can also manufacture it. Very expensive to make. And so lenses that tend to be expensive because they have some not all their lenses are made of fluorite, but they'll have one or two lens elements that are made out of fluorite just to solve that problem. And you'll see it in their brochure or in their advertising. They will refer to their lenses as having low dispersion glass or something like that. So here's an example. This is a Canon 70-200 f4 lens. We have this lens in Photolens, by the way. It's a great lens. It only, it doesn't open up to 2.8. It only opens up to 4. So for that reason, some people don't like to sign it out, but it's way lighter than the 2.8 lens, and yet the optics are fantastic. I'll just mention too, while I've got this slide open, next week, we're going to be talking about these things, these MTF graphs and what they all mean. But for now, I just want us to look at this area right here, and let's see what they say. So we're just going to zoom in here. Wow, what's so great about this lens? L series. People who are in the Canon world, they like their L series lenses. It just means more professional level and better weatherproofing and all that kind of stuff. So L series optics, light and compact, constant f4 all the way through. And right there, right in the middle, fluorite and UD lens elements. So UD stands for ultra low dispersion lens element. So you'll see fluorite, you'll see that name pop up in a lot of different ads for different lenses because it's pretty common for a manufacturer. Here's another lens by Canon. It's just their 35 millimeter 1.4 lens. Beautiful lens. Very expensive too. If you take a look at the price there, it's about $2,000, actually $2,600. And again, I don't want us to get into the nitty gritty of all the different ways that they correct for chromatic aberration. I'm showing this more to illustrate that manufacturers are working hard to solve that problem. So this is something called BR, blue spectrum refractive optics, some technology that Canon has. Doesn't matter. The point is, if you take a look down here, they are working real hard to try to bring that light to a smaller focus point. And so they're using some new developed technology that only they have and that they invented. And they've shown a couple of examples here so that we can see the difference. So you can see the diagrams there. There's ordinary glass. You can see the chromatic aberration happening there. And then they introduced this new material here, and they claim that it improves or reduces chromatic aberration, get a nice clean dot there. And then they show a couple of examples. And you can see the photo on the left. It's got a little bit of that color fringing right in here, as opposed to this area here, which is nice and clean. And there's no weird colors coming in. And you can see sort of this green color along this edge, and we don't see that there. So that's them trying to solve that problem. And I'm sure Nikon and Zeiss and all the other manufacturers are finding ways to solve that problem as well. So achromatic lens, a lens that brings two color regions together, and usually those two colors are red and blue. And you might also come across words like apochromatic, and that's a lens that corrects for all three colors. So there you go. Chromatic aberration, that is one aberration. We've got a couple more to go. Spherical aberration. Well, spherical aberration is an aberration that's just caused by the very shape of the lens. Can't really get away from it. The shape has got to be the way that it is. And basically, spherical aberration is when parallel rays of light don't come to the same focus point. A lens with a spherical surface causes the blurring of a point because it cannot bring all the light gathered from a single point to focus at a single point. So what this is showing us is light coming from an object, from a point somewhere, and you can see they're just not all coming to a focus point there. And again, I can't stress enough and we talked about this before. Where are these lines coming from? Well, if you were to let's move really far away. And if I was going to draw a flower, I'll just draw a flower here. It's like all these rays are coming from one single point on the flower, okay? The only thing is that flower is so far away that those light rays are coming in practically parallel, so we could say that's an infinity. But so all those represent one tiny point on our subject, and that should turn into one point on our sensor, and it's not happening. So the effect so spherical aberration, the effect is worse further from the optical axis. So it's especially a problem with lens with large diameters where there's more light coming from further away from optical center. If you go to photo loans, or maybe in your own camera bag, you have some lenses that when you look at the face of them are very small, and some lenses are very, very large glass at the piece of the front. So that light is coming in on those outer edges of the lens are further away from the optical axis. So lenses that are large that way tend to be prone to this problem. Spherical lenses are inexpensive. However, lenses with large apertures, fast lenses, and wide angles of view are especially affected. Manufacturers can reduce some of the problem by limiting the maximum aperture to 5.6. If lens makers want to create a lens with a large aperture, they can't use spherical lenses. They have to use aspherical lenses. These are expensive to produce. They're complicated designing, complicated grinding and polishing, all that kind of stuff makes these lenses kind of expensive to make. So there's an example of a spherical lens, and you can just sort of see, look at this crazy shape here. And, you know, what does that angle have to be at, and what's that curvature have to be at exactly to work? So you can see that it's a little bit more complicated to make a lens like that. It has a free curved surface. It's not spherical, and this will allow for solving that for larger lenses. So one of the things that you'll see in these lenses that use that type of technology is a floating lens element, because aspherical lenses, they can only correct, when they design them, they only correct for a common focusing distance. So they figure, well, hey, most of the time people are going to be this far away, the subject's going to be this far away, so we'll design our lens for that. So the problem is, what do you do when your subject's at a different location or a different distance? So what they do is they incorporate something they call a floating lens element. And you'll see inside these lenses that as you focus, there's actually a piece that can move left and right as you focus. There's a piece that's actually moving within the lens. So not only are you focusing the lens, moving it further and closer from the sensor, but you're also within those, your lens housing, there's an actual lens element that's moving back and forth as well. So it improves, just proves focusing of these lenses. So good wide angle lenses and good macro lenses tend to have floating lens elements. And that's another thing that you'll see advertised in the brochure of a lens. So another aberration is something called coma. And coma is a type of spherical aberration. It occurs when rays strike the lens at an oblique angle, and the points of light end up looking like a comet or almost like a triangular blur further away from the axis or the center of the lens, or center of the sensor, more in the corners. And there's a diagram there. So what is this showing us? These are light rays that, if you look at them, they're coming in from an angle. Imagine having an angle of view this big. Some light rays are coming through from right in front of the camera, but some light rays are coming from the side. And again, all these lines of light striking the entire surface and then having to come to a focus point somewhere on the sensor. And those light rays tend to be prone to this type of aberration. So one thing I just want to mention to you, when you look at your photos, you might not necessarily see the effects of coma. You won't see it unless you look at a photo that's, has tiny little dots against a contrasting background. Well, to help you understand kind of what this looks like, I have some advanced reading for you, and there's an article there that deals with astrophotography, photographing the stars and the Milky Way and all that kind of stuff at night. And in that article, the person sort of talks about these different aberrations that we're talking about here. But because he's photographing stars, tiny little dots against a black background, you can really see the effects of these different aberrations. So I encourage you to take a look at that article. If you find it too difficult to read, because the guy does go into quite a bit of detail, at least look at the photos and it'll help you understand, just what these aberrations are doing to our images. Actually, here's the website here. It's called Lonely Spec. And, the person is just talking about lens aberrations, specifically how they apply to people who do astrophotography. And I'm just going to zoom right down to where, there's all these articles. Again, how much you want to read is kind of up to you. And there's coma right there, and you can see it. There's some examples of kind of what you would see now. this isn't stars. This is something from a test chart that he has, but there's kind of what it looks like right there. And here's one of his astro or night shots. And you can kind of see some of this effects of coma. Anyways, let's get back to our keynote here. Stigmatism, very strange aberration, kind of difficult to explain why it happens. I've been reading about it for a few years and I still find it kind of complicated, but better to just show and describe kind of what it's all about. So this is a defect where horizontal lines and vertical lines have different focal planes. And that sounds a little bit weird, but it'll make sense when we look at the next diagram. So I put a little blurb there, sort of. You'll see what I mean in the next couple of slides. So I said horizontal and vertical lines. So horizontal, vertical lines focusing differently, sort of. You'll see that it's more about the orientation of the lines. But anyways, let's just take a look at an example of what this means. So you can see here these three letters, A, I, and O. And if you take a look at in this case, the side of the letter A, there's a vertical line, the side of the I, and even the sides of this letter O. And if you look down here, they are sharp. But if you look at the horizontal lines, they're blurry. How weird is that? And over here, the opposite is happening. The vertical lines are blurry, and the horizontal lines or horizontal edges are sharp. Lens manufacturers can never solve this problem completely because you got two different things going on. And so typically what you end up with is something called a bit of a compromise between the two. And how well they solve that problem, we'll talk about that next week when we talk about MTF graphs. But I just want to get back to this whole idea of horizontal and vertical lines. And you can sort of see it there, where imagine if you were photographing this scene. There's lines here that are one orientation, and then other lines that are perpendicular. So what do those lines represent? Well, first of all, we should know their names, tangential and sagittal. So let's take a look at what they really look like. So when we look at this line right here, these lines, the tangential, really what those lines represent are all these lines going in a circle, okay? Kind of like the rim of your bicycle tire. And then we have these lines here, which go this way. And what they're representing is the lines kind of radiating out, almost like the spokes on a tire. So that's what the tangential and sagittal lines. That's why you can see why I said sort of over here. Let's see if we can get back to that slide. That's why here I said sort of, because it's not really horizontal lines and vertical lines. We might see test charts where they put those lines together, but really what those lines are representing are sagittal and tangential lines. So when I say represent, what I'm talking about is you can go to websites that, like for example, this is bobatkins.com, but there's all kinds of different websites that offer images that you can download to test your camera to see how good it is at correcting for astigmatism. And the idea is you go to this guy's website, you download this image, and you could print it or take a picture of it while it's displayed on your screen. And what you're looking at is how you're looking at the focus of these lines compared to the focus of those lines. And that is supposed to tell you how good your lens is at solving the astigmatism problem. And typically, you would put these lines, you try to place them so that this whole illustration here shows up in one of the corners of your frame. So you wouldn't fill your frame with this, you'd put it in one of the corners, and we'll talk later on about how the center of your frame is usually quite sharp. And usually that's where you're least likely to have problems. So astigmatism, not an issue along the lens axis. So in the center, it's not usually a problem. It's always away from the center of the lens, or center from, away from the center of your sensor, towards the corners where things start to get kind of rough. And we'll talk about that next week as well. Larger apertures increase the effects of this problem. So better quality glass, let me just repeat that. Larger apertures increase the problem, okay? Increase the problem, right? So astigmatism, better quality glass, they reduce astigmatism. Most modern lenses correct heavily for that, and these lenses are called anastigmats. You typically won't see this advertised too much on a brochure for a lens, because it is kind of like something that's been pretty much solved, or most camera manufacturers solved it. So that's it for lens aberrations. I'm going to continue another video where we'll talk about distortion and diffraction, but there are a couple things that I just want you to know. We just focused on some of the main aberrations: chromatic, spherical, coma, and astigmatism. There are more of them. In fact, there's several more, but that's more for people, like I said, who study optics. These are the ones that you're most likely to read about or encounter. So here's what I want you to know, though. If you look back at some of those other aberrations and do a little bit of reading, you start to notice a pattern. And so know this: large apertures make the aberrations more visible. So aberrations are always there, but they'll be more obvious or more visible in your images when you use larger apertures. Smaller apertures make them less visible. So shutting down, going to f8, f11, f16 will make those lens aberrations almost disappear. Another observation you might make is that, hey, usually a lot of these problems happen in the corner, not in the center. So further from the center, the more visible the aberrations. Closer to the center, less visible is the aberration. So it's usually always in the corners. You might, some people, before they buy a lens, they'll test it out first. They'll go to photo loans, borrow a lens. They'll go to a store and perhaps borrow a lens. And some stores will let you do that. You give them your credit card number, they take a deposit, and they let you borrow the lens for the weekend. And then you can do a bunch of testing. A lot of people, what they'll do is they'll just photograph really boring things like a brick wall or some trees. And what they'll do is they'll go to the corners and see. They'll go to the corners and see how does the image in the corner compare to the image in the center. So if you were to photograph a brick wall, you could look at the center of your image and look at the bricks. How sharp are they? How well is the detail being preserved? And then go off to the corners, same brick, same distance from the lens. If you aimed yourself correctly at the wall, and check the corners and see, is that where problems are existing? So that's what people will usually do. They'll open up to a large aperture, focus on something flat, and check the corners to see, hey, is there, how does the corner compare to what the image looks like in the center? Anyways, there are some other imaging problems, distortion and diffraction, but I'll stop here, and this will be the end of video number 1, and I'll talk about distortion and diffraction in the second video.